Welcome to So-and-So, brought to you by Bernina, Made to Create. I'm Meg Goodman, and you're about to enjoy a casual conversation with a special member of the sewist and quilting community. A conversation about how they got started, what inspires them, what excites them, and their connection to this community. Our guest today is Ann Brauer from Ann Brauer Quilt Studio in Shelburne Falls, Massachusetts, who for more than 40 years has been making original quilts that create abstract landscapes of the imagination. Her work has been featured in numerous museums, institutions, and private collections, including the American Museum of Art Plus Design, the Lodge at Turning Stone in Verona, New York, the Federal District Courthouse in Springfield, Massachusetts, and Pat Metheny. When Ann was born on a farm in Illinois, her grandmother made a postage stamp quilt made from feed sack cloth, which Ann slept under for years and would always find different patterns and fabrics used to create the overall design. She sewed her first doll dress at 5 and made it known to her mother that to spend time together, they would have to do so at the local fabric shop. Ann quit sewing in college and then took it up again after graduation. Working as a lawyer after college, she actually used some quilting techniques to write complex citations. At age 30, she took the leap to try to support herself as a quilt maker, and she'll share with us just how all this worked out. In 2011, her life changed dramatically as her studio floated down the river during Tropical Storm Irene. She's won numerous awards, has been featured in myriad publications, and had created several commissioned pieces. In her spare time, Ann loves to garden and has huge gardens both at her home and throughout her community. Today, she lives in Asheville, Massachusetts, with her husband and 2 cats, one of whom runs out to greet her every time she comes home. Hi, Ann, and welcome to So-and-So.
Hi, Meg. I'm delighted to be here.
It's great to have you. You have so many things to share with us. I'm going to jump right into this. Now, you were touched quite literally by quilting as a newborn with a quilt your grandmother made for you. Tell us about this.
It was a wonderful quilt. My grandmother had taken feed sack cloth, carefully cut out little flowers, and put them in intricate designs. I always found something new and different in her designs. I'd wake up in the morning and saw 2 flowers similar or different, and it just really made me love what you could do with quilts.
So it kept you busy and entertained, which I'm sure was appreciated by the adults in your life when you were a child.
Oh, yeah.
Now, you sewed your first doll clothes. You were 5 years old. How did you learn to do this, and what interested you about sewing?
I just loved fabric. I was actually visiting a cousin of my father's who I was never became that close to, but she thought, what a nice thing to do with a 5-year-old. So she showed me how to take the needle and put the little pieces of fabric together. I was very proud of myself.
Oh, I can imagine. Do you still have any of those doll clothes?
No.
So now, when you got into high school, you sewed for musicals. What are some of the more memorable ones, and what costumes did you make for them?
The one I remembered most, and I forget which musical it was, but I had to make 10 or 20 tutus out of that organza netting.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that
Oh,
got to be
my.
tedious. But it was such a wonderful effect.
Now, you volunteered to sew for the musicals. Is this just because you loved it so much you just wanted to take this skill and apply it in things outside of sewing for yourself?
I think that was partly it. Obviously, I wanted to contribute to my high school.
Hmm.
I wasn't an actor, I couldn't sing, but I could sew. So, it was sort of fun to be involved as a teenager with other people around you. I was also heavily involved in 4 H. Um, and I made many, many, many clothes through
Hmm.
4 H.
Did you enter those in competitions?
Yes. I mean, the 4-H in Illinois was wonderful because it was really established with a county level and a state level. And so you'd always take it to be juried. One thing I made, which I find terribly ironic, was placemats. And my placemats would very frequently go to the state fair. Now, anybody who knows my work knows that I still make placemats, a different style, but there's something about them that I just find easy, intriguing, so useful, and very happy.
What are some of your favorite clothings to construct?
Eventually, I got to the point where I loved using Vogue patterns. You know, those very technical jackets with the horsehair lining and, the bound buttonholes. Um, I just loved the challenge of putting it all together. The problem became, this was in the 60s. I
Mm-hmm.
wasn't wearing them. I was wearing blue jeans like everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
So eventually, even though the fabrics were just amazing because I had access to designer fabrics from New York City. Oh, those wools were so beautiful. It just didn't make sense to spend my time doing that. Plus, I was in college and I had lots of other things to do. So I quit sewing for a while.
And I want to talk about that. It's something you loved. You stopped sewing. You took it up again after graduating with a focus on quilting. So, what was it like to stop doing something that you love so much? And then what made you start again and focused on quilting?
Well, actually, I was living in Boston at that time, and Chinatown in Boston had these wonderful fabric stores, which I would just sort of haunt, a little spare time. Let's go down to Chinatown and look at the fabrics and try to figure out how I could possibly use it. But I couldn't purchase because I had no use for it. So that was frustrating. And then when I had a roommate after college who made quilts, I realized if I made quilts, I could buy fabric. So my first quilt was an Ohio star I made by hand. Don't ask me why, but it was by hand. I loved the overall design, how each block added to the next one, and the fabrics sort of danced around. Um, Obviously, I quit working by hand. I liked instant gratification, but it was just this greatest excuse to buy fabric. I ran out of friends to give them to. I tried different patterns. And then I said, okay, well, what happens if? And there was actually a fabric store in Cambridge that also sold quilts. So I said, if I make quilts and sell them, I can keep making quilts. Um, and I can afford to buy whatever fabric I want. It was very, very addictive.
It sounds like it. Do you still have that Ohio Star quilt?
Oh, no. It had a nice, happy life, but it eventually went the way of most quilts. Sad, but true.
Do you have a favorite quilt that has a special meaning to it so far?
That is such a tough question. I get asked it all the time. And frequently I say my favorite quilt is the one I've just finished. I do have a few quilts that have sort of become iconic to me. I called it October Sunrise, and it was a simple study in golds, oranges, and reds that radiated out. My husband used to kid me when I made that quilt, saying I was printing money because I knew every time I made that quilt, it would sell, which was interesting. And eventually, I had made it for every place I was showing it, and I had to quit making it. I got to see one of the original quilts versus next to one of the quilts just before I quit. And it was really interesting to see how the different colors, my expertise, and the way I constructed it varied, even though I was trying to be consistent.
Hmm. Now, what I love is the story that you used quilting techniques and applied them to your work when you practiced law, and you had to prepare complex citations and case theories. Please tell us about this.
Oh, most of the lawyers, I drove everybody crazy. Most of the lawyers would sit there halfway through the research and say, okay, this is how you win the case. And then they would write it up. I did not know how to do that. What I had to do, this was back in the years of Xeroxes. So I'd Xerox everything I was going to use, cut and paste it on my living room floor to see how to get the arguments to flow in just the right order. Then, when I was done, I knew how you could win your case. But I really needed to work with my hands to do that. Eventually, when I started making quilts, I realized I was just making quilts when I was making these briefs and arguments. It was pretty funny, I thought.
It's certainly unique, and it sounds like it worked pretty well for you in the cases that you worked on.
Yeah, it was exciting. You know, I worked on many different cases. I don't remember most of them, but, trying to figure out the different aspects of each complex case and how it related to what had been decided before, what was unique about it, and what you should basically decide the same way using precedent about the case. So it was fun for a while.
Is exacting as quilting and sewing. Now, when you turned 30, you wanted to decide if you should live in Boston or the country I'm quoting here, as an adult. And then you found a cabin in Western Massachusetts and decided to see if you could support yourself as a quilt maker. Um, how did that go, and what techniques did you learn during this time? Tell us this story of great transition.
It was exciting. I just realized I needed to try because I had so many friends who were living in Boston going, well, when I grow up, I'll do XYZ. And it's like, I don't want to be in that state years from now saying, when I grow up. I realized I had to try. Um, so I was lucky to find this wonderful little cabin, unfinished. I had to do a lot of the finish work myself. And in the back of my head, I didn't tell people I was going to try to support myself as a quilt maker. I didn't figure anybody would sell the property to me if I did that. But, here I was, a lawyer from Boston, blah, blah, blah. And so they sold me this really sweet little place in the middle of the woods. The first winter was very, very hard because the cabin was unfinished, and I tried to heat with chestnut wood,
Hmm.
which has no thermals. You put it in, it burns, and you're still cold. But I learned a lot. I learned how to be independent, and I also kept trying to figure out how to support myself as a quilt maker. I kept making quilts, taking them into Boston to sell, and finally decided to try them at a craft show, just to see if there was a market for them. Now, this was a really interesting time in the craft world, in the quilt world, because they were just realizing that quilts could be art. There had been a couple of shows of Amish quilts and Afro American quilts, and the public was beginning to look at quilts as something more than function. So I would experiment with my quilts. I would get people angry at me that I quit being a lawyer to be a quilt maker. Oh, I would get people, the quilt police, telling me that their seams were straighter than mine. Yes, but it was such a learning experience. I started making the log cabin quilt very soon. I loved the geometries of it.
Tell us about that quilt.
Well, there are so many different log cabin quilts. Pretty soon, I was taking many of the designs of the log cabin quilts and changing the colors throughout. So it could go from reds to blues to greens to yellows or any other variation I wanted. And then there would be a counter color change within the log cabin. So they were very geometric. very simple, but they said more than many traditional quilts said at the time. One quilt I remember I made based on birch trees in February. Now, if you look at birch trees in February, the bark is starting to peel. So you see the white, you see the grays and the blacks, and then underneath you see this hint of pink. And this went against the sky, which was also, the pink colors of sunrise and sunset in the winter. So I had lots of fun making that quilt. And I loved it when I explained this story to it, that it sold right away.
I can imagine. How long did you live in that cabin?
I lived in that cabin for, I think it was 13 years.
Mm-hmm.
I added to the cabin. By that point, I had received some very fancy grants. I realized I definitely could become a quilt maker. I definitely needed more space, so I had added to the cabin, making it twice the size, putting in this wonderful studio with high ceilings, north windows. It felt very open. But I met my husband, and my husband had two wonderful, they're my stepkids, who were used to his house. So I moved into his house and rented the cabin.
So you're talking. You mentioned the grants that you received. So I want to talk about that a little bit. You were active when the Art Quilt, and you mentioned this also, movement was beginning to thrive, and there were many fine art fairs for selling your work. And during this period of time, your work was juried into Quilt National 2 times, and you received grants from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Massachusetts Artist Foundation. And one of your quilts is in the permanent collection of the Museum of Art and Design in New York. What a time of growth for you, Anne. Tell us about the quilt that's on permanent collection and just how the art movement evolved your work.
The quilt in the permanent collection basically was another color study, where the colors were all in blocks. I created the blocks by piecing together the different fabrics. So it was a quilt about quilts because quilts are made in blocks. And so I like the sort of double entendre, I make the block and then you sew it together and you create the overall quilt. So it's very simple. Each of the blocks was edged in color, so it really showed off as a block. And that's what I remember about it most.
Must be quite an honor to have a quilt in the permanent collection of that museum.
It was amazing. They had a whole show. It was called Six Continents of Quilts. It was a couple years after I'd been in the Quilt Nationals when I had changed my pattern. And I went down to the opening just after 9/11. You could still smell the smoke, which was really sad. But there were so many people I'd met at the Quilt Nationals, so it was sort of a reunion, seeing what different people were doing. Some of the people didn't recognize me because many of the art quilt people were more into the art aspect, and I was into the selling aspect.
Mm-hmm.
So I tended to sell through fine craft shows. For me, it just felt more like my venue and where I felt comfortable. But it was still a very exciting time. They hung my quilt. By that point, I was known for the backs of my pieces because I would use different solid colors on the backs, very random. But it really helped in terms of selling for people to see that this wasn't purchased or anything. Each piece was made separately. And they hung it. There was a sidewalk. It was someplace in New York City with a big window, and they hung the quilt so passersby could see the back of the quilt, which I thought was really cool.
That is really cool. You mentioned 9/11, and did that have an effect on your work?
Yes and no. One thing I discovered, by that point, I had purchased a studio in Shelburne Falls. And I was working in the studio. And one thing because travel was so limited, people kept coming into my studio. They were stuck in town. They were stuck out here till they could fly home, and they wanted something to calm them, to make them feel happy and hopeful. And I realized that for me, that is what I want my quilts to do. So it sort of reinforced where my quilts were going, um, what I was trying to accomplish with my
Mm-hmm.
quilts.
Mm-hmm.
And it really told me the power of fabric that it has for so many different people.
You mentioned your studio in Shelburne Falls, and it's a tourist town, and you used your methods of quilt as you go, and this is great. You created interpretations of the open skies of the Midwest where you grew up. And being a Midwest girl myself, I know those skies. So, first of all, why did you choose Shelburne Falls?
Because Shelburne Falls is about 8 miles from Ashfield, where I live. It's where the artists in town congregate. So I found it just wonderful. Even before I got the studio, when I was working out of my cabin in the woods, I would spend a lot of time in Shelburne Falls to be around other artists.
Mm-hmm.
People who were struggling, and we had the same issues and concerns, and we could reassure each other. And I when I was building the new addition to my house, I had used a friend's studio for a couple months. I loved being in town. After I met my husband and moved into his house, I felt very isolated. It was harder to get into town, and working by myself, he was away working, was more difficult, and there were more distractions around. So I felt like I really wanted a studio in town
Mm-hmm.
and the seriousness of a studio. I was so lucky. I found this old garage building from the 1930s that had been a video store. The video store was closing. They hadn't even told their helper. I toured the video store. Um, it was right along the river, beautiful views, and I purchased it right away. And I loved being in town.
But the next part of that story is that in 2011, your studio, your beloved studio, floated down that river during Tropical Storm Irene. Would you tell us this amazing story?
It was very sad, very amazing. I was actually doing a craft show north of Chicago. The Irene had been forecast to go up the coast of Massachusetts, maybe lingering in Rhode Island, maybe heading up to Maine. My father-in-law lived by himself in Rhode Island, right along the coast. I was worried about him. My husband was off kayaking the coast of Maine. I was very worried about him. I was not really worried about my studio because Irene was not supposed to come here. So I was at the craft show, and all of a sudden, I get a phone message from my husband. We'd had the rain in Ashfield, but not nearly enough. But he had received a phone call from my stepdaughter, who goes, "Dad, have you seen whatever it was, YouTube? Aunt's studio is flooding." He called me to let me know. I was across from somebody also from Shelburne Falls who had one of the first iPads, so he would run out to get an internet connection. You could tell this was a while ago. And I'd watch the water level go up and up and up on the studio, going, oh my God. And then eventually the studio, which was on piers, picked itself up, did a dance, turned around a couple times, and then headed downstream. It was totally surreal. Here I was at a craft show, not knowing what was going to happen.
And what was that like to see? What did that feel like?
It was incredibly hard. I mean, I would go into they have exhibitor lounges, and I would go into the exhibitor lounge and go, and you cannot cry. You really cannot cry. You don't know what's going to happen, but you have to be out there selling as much of your work as you possibly can. because who knows what you're coming home to. I was very lucky because I was at that craft show because there was no notice, and I had half my quilts with me. So I just sort of kept on a real stiff upper lip. Cousins of my husband helped me take down everything and put it in my car, which was so nice of them. And I drove. The second day I was in New York State. Oh, I did not want to go home. Oh, I did not want to, but of course I had to. I cried driving through Cleveland, Ohio. I don't know why. Maybe because the interstate there goes right through the city with lots of turns, going far faster than I would like to go on that road. No place to turn over, and tears were streaming down my face. It was an interesting drive. And then when I got there, my husband was very sweet. He said, "Come on down. I'll meet you and we'll go down and see your studio," which hadn't gone quite over the river into the dam. There were a couple of maple trees that said, "Nope, as far as you're going."
Oh, my.
It was all covered with mud, etc. A few things my husband could rescue, like my sewing machine, which was metal and could just get fixed. Some things, like an award I'd received, a glass award, just floated with it and was upright. The fabric was gone. The quilts I hadn't liked were gone. The studio, the town called me up the next day and said, "Is it okay if we demolish it?" And I go, "Yep." They had FEMA money and I didn't. I was so lucky, though, because the town rallied around me. A realtor friend of mine said, "We've got a place for rent. You can have it." Within almost, it was a little more than a week, I was moved into a new place and I had my first sale. People would walk in, "What can I do to help?" I had no idea how to set up a studio because I'd set up the old one, over a long period of time. This was setting up a studio in a couple of weeks. What did I need? How was I going to get money? Would I be able to keep going? It was a challenge, but there was somebody who came in to help me paint. I never learned his name. He just came in and said he wanted to help, and he painted things that, needed painting. The other amazing thing that happened is that quilt makers across the world heard about me. The YouTube video of my studio floating got 70,000 hits on YouTube. And so I would receive packages of fabric every day. Some of them were the sweetest things, little old writing. "This is the only fabric I have, but I hope it helps." I had a friend who lived locally. They had plenty of money. And she goes, "I could use some new fabric. Why don't you fabric shop my fabric closet so I can buy new fabric?" It was just amazing and very heartwarming.
It's quite a community that came around you.
It was amazing, yes.
And are you still in the studio today?
I built a new studio. I lived in what I call the studio in exile I decided to give myself a year to decide if I wanted to rebuild or to stay in the studio that I was renting. The studio that I was renting was serviceable. It had south light, which is not my favorite. It was a little awkward. It was renting, and it looked right onto the scene of where my old studio had been, which had north and east light and views of the river to die for. So after a year, I said, "Yes, I'm going to rebuild." I got a great contractor and rebuilt this most amazing studio because I knew exactly what I wanted, where the window should be, where the sewing machine was going to be. It's 5 feet higher, so that it's above where it flooded the last time. And so it's the studio of my dreams, and I'm there.
That's a great story. And Anne, what are you doing today with your work?
What am I doing today with my work? Okay, that's a big question. I am still making quilts. I love to make quilts. I'm working on a large order, 6 custom pieces in neutral colors for a hotel in Boston. It's a challenge because I work with color, but it's a fun challenge. I still do craft shows. My studio is still open to the public. I have more orders than I can fill, high class worries. I have so many quilts I want to make. When I'm at a craft show, I draw up designs for quilts, and then I have to choose what it is I want to make. So I'm still excited about it. I love to buy fabric still. I just see so many quilts I want to make. I want to continue the neutral series because I think after the 6 go to the hotel, I'm going to want to do more work in neutrals and see how far I can push really simple designs.
Mm-hmm. So besides that, is there any other next projects for you?
I'm getting ready for a major craft show in Philadelphia. I just got into today. I have several orders from different customers who just love this piece or this piece or this piece. And some of it, I try not, even though it sounds like I'm super booked, I try to allow myself time to play. And so I don't talk about the new quilts. I let them just sort of evolve.
And you've done so much. What's your dream?
To make quilts until they carry me out feet first.
Beautiful. Now, we've talked about so many things, and your stories are just wonderful to listen to. Is there any question I didn't ask you that you wish I had?
I think you ask a large number of questions.
Well, you have a large number of things to tell us.
Well, doing craft shows helps because people ask me questions and I try to engage the viewers.
Mm-hmm. And it has been wonderful to talk to you today. Thank you so much for joining us. I know our listeners would like to reach out to you, so what's the best way for them to do so?
Well, I have a website, which is www.annbrauer, ANNBRAUER.com. I also post on Instagram almost every day, Anne Brauer Quilts, QUILTS.
And you also mentioned that people come to visit you at your studio. Can they find out where to find you on your website?
Yes. My studio is open to the public. Every day I'm there. If you're coming from a distance, give me a call or an email just to double check. But I love having people come into my studio. I love the conversations. I love having the interaction with the customer where I get to see how they are reacting to the pieces I am making.
And I would invite our listeners, when they do come to visit you, when they introduce themselves to you, to tell you that they heard this conversation on so-and-so.
I would love to hear about that.
And thank you again so very much.
Well, thank you.
Wonderful. And there you have it, another story about someone just like you, someone for whom sewing and quilting is so much more than a hobby. It's a way of life and a connection to something bigger. If you know someone you think has an outstanding story and a story that should be shared on this podcast, please drop me a note to meg@soandsopodcast.com or complete the form on our website. Be sure to subscribe to, review, and rate this podcast on your favorite platform, and visit our website, soandsopodcast.com, for more information about today's and all of our guests. That's sewandsopodcast.com. And finally, I'd like to thank Bernina for making this program possible. I'm Meg Goodman, and I look forward to you joining us next time on So and So.